So this is how white people defeat loneliness. The question drifted through the cold desert air so softly that Elias Mercer almost thought the wind had spoken it. The old rancher looked up from the black coffee warming his rough hands and found Nayeli staring toward the valley below. A white family stood outside a small wagon camp nearly 200 yards away, laughing quietly beneath lantern light while their little boy chased fireflies through the grass. The mother scooped the child into her arms, and the father kissed the top of the boy's head like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nayeli watched them the way someone watches rain after living through years of drought. Her dark Apache eyes reflected the campfire beside Elias, though somehow they looked older than the mountains behind her. "Can I try too?" she asked. Elias nearly dropped the tin cup into the dirt. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the crackle of mesquite wood and the distant cry of a coyote somewhere beyond the canyon. Nayeli tilted her head slightly, confused by his silence. She wore one of Elias's old wool blankets around her shoulders, the oversized fabric swallowing her slender frame, while silver beads in her long black braid glimmered softly in the firelight. There was no teasing in her voice, no shame either, just honest curiosity, and somehow, that made the question far more dangerous. Elias cleared his throat roughly and stared into the flames instead of at her. "You ask strange questions," he muttered. Nayeli smiled faintly. "Apache women are taught strange questions uncover true hearts." That answer settled heavily inside his chest. Elias Mercer had spent 6 years avoiding true hearts. 6 years avoiding people altogether. His ranch sat nearly 40 miles from the nearest proper town because silence hurt less than memory. The weathered cabin behind them held no laughter, no piano music, no small boots by the doorway, just dust, coffee grounds, and the ghost of things he no longer allowed himself to think about after sundown. But this Apache woman kept stepping into the quiet corners of him like she belonged there. He had found her 3 days ago near Dry Creek after her horse threw a shoe crossing rocky ground. Most people in these territories would have pointed her toward town and kept riding. Elias should have done the same. Instead, he fixed the horse himself, offered her water, and somehow allowed her to stay through one rainstorm that became 2. Now she sat beside his fire asking questions no one had dared ask him in years. Nayeli watched the family below until the little boy disappeared into the wagon beside his parents. Then she looked back toward Elias with that same calm curiosity. "White people build families because they fear being alone?" she asked quietly. Elias let out a tired breath through his nose. "Sometimes. And does it work?" The old rancher stared at the flames dancing against the darkness. The fire painted soft gold across the lines in his face, but it could not warm the cold buried behind his eyes. He thought about the tiny wooden crosses behind his barn, thought about winter snow piling against graves too small to make sense in a fair world. Thought about how empty a ranch could feel even with 50 head of cattle and 10 open acres beneath the stars. Finally, he answered in the only honest way he knew how. "Not always." Nayeli studied him carefully then, like she could hear the sorrow hiding underneath those 2 words. The desert wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and cedar smoke through the night. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the horizon. And for the first time in many years, Elias Mercer realized the silence around his ranch no longer felt empty. It felt fragile. Morning arrived slowly over Mercer Ranch, pouring pale gold sunlight across 12 empty acres of dry grass and weathered fence posts that leaned like tired old men against the wind. Elias Mercer stood near the horse trough tightening a saddle strap when he heard soft singing drifting from behind the barn. He paused immediately. The sound was low and steady, almost blending into the breeze itself. Apache words, gentle ones, the kind sung around fires long before white towns carved roads through the desert. Elias walked around the corner carefully and stopped when he saw her. Nayeli sat cross-legged in the dirt beside a half-broken chicken coop with 3 small chicks gathered in her lap beneath the morning sun. One of them chirped weakly while she wrapped a thin strip of cloth around its tiny leg with surprising concentration. "That bird is not going to survive," Elias said quietly. Nayeli glanced up at him without offense. "Maybe not." She adjusted the cloth carefully. "But Apache people do not abandon something simply because it is small." Elias looked away first. The answer landed harder than it should have. Dust rolled softly across the yard while the scent of coffee drifted from the cabin window behind them. Nayeli rose smoothly to her feet, brushing dirt from her buckskin skirt before carrying the injured chick toward the shade beside the porch. She moved differently from women Elias had known in town. Nothing rushed her. Nothing seemed forced. Even silence sat naturally on her shoulders. White women in town do not sit in dirt with chickens, Elias muttered while lifting a saddle onto his horse. Nayeli tilted her head. White women in town also wear shoes that make them walk like injured deer. Elias laughed before he could stop himself. A short, rough laugh, real enough that it startled him. Nayeli noticed it immediately. Her eyes narrowed with quiet curiosity, like she had just discovered something hidden beneath stone. "There," she said softly. "You look younger when you laugh." Elias cleared his throat and focused on the saddle again. "You always speak whatever enters your mind. Most people hide truth because they fear what comes after it." She stepped closer, holding the small chick carefully against her chest. Apache children are taught that honest words save time. Elias shook his head slowly. Honest words usually start fights in white towns. Then maybe white towns are lonely because nobody says what they truly mean. That one stayed with him long after she disappeared inside the cabin. Near noon, Elias rode into Briar Creek for supplies, while Nayeli remained behind to mend blankets on the porch beneath the cottonwood tree. Briar Creek was the sort of town that noticed everything and forgave nothing. By the time Elias stepped into the general store, conversations had already slowed. Three men near the pickle barrel glanced toward him before pretending not to. Old Martha Higgins folded fabric behind the counter with the sharp expression of a woman storing gossip like winter food. "Heard you brought home company," she said casually. Elias kept his eyes on the coffee sacks. "Just helping somebody whose horse needed fixing." Martha snorted softly. "People say she is Apache." The room grew quieter somehow. Elias tied the coffee sack shut without looking up. "People say many things." One of the ranch hands near the window chuckled under his breath. "Careful, Mercer. Folks start talking when a man lives alone too long." Elias rested one weathered hand against the counter and finally looked around the room. "Calm. Steady. Funny," he said quietly. "I do not remember asking Briar Creek permission to drink coffee on my own land." Nobody answered after that. But when Elias rode home beneath the afternoon sun, he could still feel the town watching his back from half a mile away. And somehow, what unsettled him most was not their judgment. It was the strange realization that for the first time in years, he was actually in a hurry to get home. The storm arrived just before sundown, rolling across the Arizona desert in long dark waves that swallowed the mountains one ridge at a time. Elias Mercer secured the barn doors against the rising wind, while thunder growled somewhere beyond the canyon walls like an old warning returning home. Dust swirled through the yard hard enough to sting the eyes, and the horses shifted nervously inside their stalls. Usually, storms made the ranch feel even emptier. Tonight felt different. Warm light glowed through the cabin windows, flickering softly against the rain clouds gathering overhead. Someone was inside waiting. That thought unsettled him more than the storm itself. Elias stepped onto the porch, removed his hat, and froze halfway through the doorway. Nayeli sat cross-legged on the wooden floor near the fireplace with one of his old family photo albums resting carefully in her lap. The fire painted gold across her dark hair while rain tapped gently against the roof overhead. She looked up immediately, though she did not appear ashamed for touching something personal. "You had children," she said softly. Not a question. Elias felt something tighten painfully in his chest. The room suddenly smelled like wet earth, smoke, and old memory. He set his hat down slowly beside the door, but did not move closer. Nayeli lowered her eyes toward the faded photograph in her hands. A younger Elias stood smiling beside a woman with bright eyes and two small children no older than 6. Time had faded the picture around the edges, but happiness still lived inside it somehow. "Your son had your eyes," Nayeli whispered. Elias stared at the floorboards. "You should not go through other people's things. In Apache families, photographs are sacred." She closed the album carefully with both hands. "I thought maybe speaking their names keeps spirits warm." Silence settled heavily between them while thunder rolled again outside. Elias finally walked toward the fire and took the album from her hands with surprising gentleness. His rough fingers lingered against the worn leather cover longer than necessary. "Matthew," he said quietly. My son's name was Matthew. Naeli listened without interrupting. And my daughter was Clara. The names sounded strange in the cabin after so many silent years. Like voices buried beneath dust finally breathing again. Elias sat slowly in the chair beside the fire, his shoulders looking older somehow beneath the flickering light. Fever came through here 6 winters ago. Fast. He swallowed once. By the time the doctor reached the ranch, there was not much left for him to do. Naeli lowered her gaze respectfully. Outside, rain finally began falling in steady sheets against the roof. Elias stared into the flames as if afraid to look anywhere else. After I buried them, people kept telling me life moves on. A bitter smile touched his face for less than a second. Funny thing about grief. It does not move anywhere. It just waits where you left it. Naeli studied him quietly across the firelight. Most women from Briar Creek would have rushed to comfort him with soft words or pity. She did neither. Instead, she reached beside the fireplace and placed another log onto the flames with calm, deliberate movements. Apache widows sit with sorrow differently, she said after a while. Elias glanced toward her tiredly. How? Naeli watched sparks drift upward through the chimney. We believe pain grows larger when a person tries to carry it alone. The storm deepened outside, wrapping the ranch in darkness and rain. Elias listened to the steady crackling fire, while Naeli quietly poured coffee into 2 tin cups near the stove. She handed one to him without speaking further. Their fingers brushed for only a second. Warm skin against cold calluses. Small. Harmless. Yet Elias felt it all the way down in the lonely places he had boarded shut years ago. He accepted the cup slowly. You always know the exact wrong thing to say at the exact right time. Naeli smiled faintly over the steam rising between them. No. Her eyes reflected firelight again. Calm. Honest. Dangerous in ways she probably did not even understand. Only with lonely men. By the 4th morning, Naeli moved through Mercer Ranch like she had always belonged there. Elias noticed it in small ways first. The water bucket beside the stable stayed full without him touching it. His coffee beans were ground before sunrise. One of the loose fence rails near the north pasture had been repaired with rawhide cords stronger than the nails he normally used himself. She never announced what she fixed. She simply saw something broken and quietly gave it care. That unsettled him more than chaos ever could. Elias stood outside sharpening an old ranch knife against smooth stone when Naeli stepped onto the porch carrying his daughter's tiny blue scarf folded neatly in her hands. The sight of it made his stomach tighten instantly. He had not seen that scarf in nearly 2 years. I found this beneath the cedar chest, she said softly. Elias took the scarf slowly, rough fingers brushing across faded fabric once worn by small hands. The wind shifted gently through the yard, carrying the smell of horses and dry grass beneath the warming Arizona sun. Clara used to wear that everywhere, he murmured before he could stop himself. Naeli sat carefully beside him on the porch steps without asking permission. Apache children keep objects close when they fear forgetting love, she said. Elias stared at the scarf for a long moment. White people are not much different. Naeli smiled faintly. I know. Silence settled between them comfortably now. Not empty. Not strained. The kind of silence that only happens when 2 lonely people stop pretending they prefer solitude. Elias leaned back against the wooden porch post, while Naeli watched dust drift across the open pasture. Somewhere near the barn, chickens clucked lazily beneath the morning heat. Can I ask another strange question? She asked after a while. Elias sighed heavily. You are going to ask it whether I say yes or no. That made her laugh softly beneath her breath. A small sound. Warm enough to loosen something deep in his chest again. Why do white men stop smiling after marriage? She asked. Elias blinked slowly toward her. That is your question? I watch couples in Briar Creek. She rested her elbows against her knees thoughtfully. Before marriage, men look at women like sunrise. After marriage, they look tired. Elias let out a rough chuckle despite himself. You spend too much time observing people. Observation keeps people alive. She glanced sideways at him then. Besides, you looked happier in your photographs than most men in town. The smile faded from Elias's face slowly after that. He stared toward the distant hills shimmering beneath heat waves. Love does not make people tired, he said quietly. Loss does. Naeli absorbed that answer carefully. He could almost see her turning the words over in her mind like smooth stones inside a river. Then she asked another question. Softer this time. More dangerous. Do you think loneliness can become a habit? Elias did not answer immediately. A hawk circled high above the ranch while the old windmill creaked somewhere behind the barn. Finally, he nodded once. Worst habit there is. Nayeli lowered her gaze toward her hands folded calmly in her lap. My grandmother used to say lonely people build walls so slowly they forget they are prisoners inside them. Elias looked at her sharply then. Something about the way she said it felt less like conversation and more like someone quietly opening a locked door he had spent years holding shut. Before he could respond, the distant sound of approaching horses echoed faintly across the plains. Elias stood immediately. 3 riders appeared near the southern ridge, moving steadily toward Mercer Ranch through rising dust. Nayeli followed his gaze, and for the first time since arriving there, the calm softness left her face entirely. Her shoulders stiffened slightly beneath the sunlight. Those men, she whispered carefully. They are from Briar Creek. Elias narrowed his eyes toward the riders growing larger against the horizon. Then he noticed something else. The man leading them wore a sheriff's badge bright enough to catch the morning sun from half a mile away. The 3 riders stopped 20 feet from the porch, their horses restless beneath the dry afternoon heat, while dust drifted slowly around their boots like smoke that refused to settle. Sheriff Coleman sat at the front with one hand resting near his saddle horn and the other shielding his eyes from the sun. Beside him rode Pastor Whitmore from Briar Creek Church, stiff in his black coat despite the heat, and behind them sat Deputy Harris, young enough to still look uncomfortable carrying authority. Elias Mercer remained standing near the porch rail, calm and unreadable, while Nayeli stayed seated on the wooden steps beside him with the blue scarf folded quietly in her lap. Nobody spoke at first. The silence stretched long enough for the horses to start shifting nervously beneath it. Finally, Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. Afternoon, Mercer. Elias nodded once. Coleman. The sheriff's eyes moved toward Nayeli carefully. Not cruel. Not friendly either. Just cautious in the way men become cautious when towns begin whispering too loudly. We heard you got company staying out here. Elias leaned one shoulder against the porch post. Looks like your hearing still works. Deputy Harris almost smiled at that before catching himself. Pastor Whitmore did not. His eyes stayed fixed on Nayeli with the tight expression of a man trying too hard to appear righteous. This woman is Apache, the pastor said flatly. Nayeli looked up at him calmly. And you are observant. The deputy coughed suddenly to hide what sounded suspiciously like laughter. Sheriff Coleman shot him a warning glance before turning back toward Elias. People in town are nervous, he said carefully. You know how Briar Creek gets when rumors start moving faster than facts. Elias folded his arms slowly. And what exactly are the facts today? The sheriff hesitated. Pastor Whitmore answered instead. Folks are saying she has been living here alone with you for days. Nayeli frowned slightly at that. There are chickens here too. Deputy Harris looked down at his saddle immediately, shoulders shaking once beneath suppressed laughter. Even Sheriff Coleman rubbed a hand across his mouth to hide a smile before catching Pastor Whitmore glaring at him. Elias noticed Nayeli studying them all with genuine confusion. To her, the situation probably seemed ridiculous. 3 grown men riding 40 miles through dust and heat because a lonely rancher shared coffee and shelter with a woman. This is not your concern, Elias said quietly. Pastor Whitmore straightened in his saddle. It becomes my concern when the town starts asking questions about morality. Something cold entered Elias Mercer's eyes then. Not anger. Worse. Weariness. Funny thing about Briar Creek, he said slowly. People there ignored me for 6 years straight. But the second laughter returns to my porch. Suddenly, everyone remembers the road to my ranch. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Sheriff Coleman exhaled softly through his nose while Pastor Whitmore stiffened visibly. Nayeli glanced toward Elias with an expression that looked dangerously close to understanding. The pastor adjusted himself in the saddle and tried again. You are a respected man, Mercer. People expect certain standards. Elias looked toward the endless desert behind them before answering. Respect that disappears because somebody offers kindness to an Apache woman was never respect to begin with. The afternoon wind moved quietly through the pasture after that, carrying the dry scent of cedar and horses. Beneath the blazing Arizona sky, nobody seemed eager to speak first anymore. Then Nayeli rose slowly from the porch steps, still holding Clara's blue scarf carefully in both hands. She looked directly at Pastor Whitmore with calm, dark eyes untouched by shame. "In my tribe," she said softly, "people only interfere with lonely hearts when they wish to help heal them." Her gaze shifted briefly toward Briar Creek, far beyond the hills. "Your town rides 40 miles only to make them lonelier." Even the horses seemed quieter after that. Sheriff Coleman lowered his eyes first. Pastor Whitmore's jaw tightened sharply, but no answer came. Because somewhere deep beneath the heat and dust and judgment, everyone standing there knew the Apache woman had spoken the truth. That night, the ranch felt quieter than usual after the riders left. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet. The kind that settles over a place after words are spoken that cannot be taken back. Elias sat alone on the porch steps beneath the pale glow of an oil lantern while the desert stretched endlessly around him beneath cold starlight. Somewhere far out beyond the canyon, coyotes called to one another through the darkness. Usually he liked that sound. Tonight it only reminded him how quickly lonely things recognize each other. The front door creaked softly behind him. Nayeli stepped onto the porch, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee wrapped carefully in cloth to keep the heat from burning her hands. She handed one to Elias without speaking and sat beside him close enough for their shoulders to nearly touch, but not quite. They stared out toward the sleeping pasture together while the windmill groaned slowly somewhere behind the barn. "Your town fears silence," Nayeli said quietly after a while. Elias glanced sideways at her. "What makes you think that?" She lifted the coffee cup toward her lips thoughtfully. "Because the moment silence changes, they rush to fill it with gossip." Elias let out a tired breath through his nose. Briar Creek survives on 2 things: dust and other people's business. That earned the faintest smile from her. It disappeared quickly, though. Nayeli stared toward the horizon where distant lightning flickered behind black storm clouds gathering miles away. "I did not mean to bring trouble to your ranch." Elias leaned back against the porch post slowly. "Trouble arrived long before you did." He took another sip of coffee before adding quietly, "You were just the first thing around here that made the place feel alive again." The words settled between them heavily. Honest words. Dangerous ones. Nayeli lowered her eyes toward the steam rising from her cup. "Apache women are taught something when they are children," she said softly. "If a man speaks honestly while looking at the stars, then he has already stopped lying to himself." Elias stared out into the dark pasture after that. He hated how easily she seemed to reach places inside him other people could not even find. The wind shifted colder across the porch, carrying the scent of rain somewhere far off beyond the mesas. Then Nayeli asked another question, gentle this time, almost careful. "Why did you never marry again?" Elias closed his eyes briefly. There it was, the question waiting beneath all the others. He could have lied, could have hidden behind the same hard silence he used with everyone else in Briar Creek. But somehow the darkness beside Nayeli felt different from ordinary loneliness. Softer, safer. "Because after Clara died," he said slowly, "my wife stopped speaking much." The porch creaked quietly beneath them while he searched for the right words. "One morning I woke up and realized we were both grieving in separate rooms inside the same house." His voice roughened slightly. A few months later, she packed her things before sunrise and left for Tucson to stay with her sister. Nayeli listened without interruption. "Did she stop loving you?" Elias stared toward the empty barn across the yard. No, a sad smile touched his face for barely a second. That was the problem. The lantern flame flickered softly beside them while thunder rolled low and distant through the mountains. "Sometimes love survives," Elias whispered, "but people still break underneath it." Nayeli absorbed those words in silence. Then, very carefully, she reached out and placed her hand over his. Warm skin against weathered calluses. Nothing improper, nothing rushed. Yet Elias felt the simple touch strike deeper than anything he had experienced in years. "In my tribe," she said quietly, "people believe grief becomes dangerous when nobody is left to witness it." Elias looked down at her hand resting over his. Small, steady, real. The old rancher suddenly realized something terrifying in that moment. For the first time since burying his children, he no longer wanted to be alone with his sorrow. The next morning arrived wrapped in cold gray clouds that turned the desert sky the color of worn steel. Elias woke before sunrise out of habit, But for several quiet seconds, he simply lay still beneath his blanket listening to unfamiliar sounds moving through the cabin. Soft footsteps, a kettle warming over the stove, low humming drifting through the darkness like smoke from another lifetime. He stared at the ceiling above him, while the old ache inside his chest twisted strangely beneath those simple noises. For 6 years, mornings had belonged only to silence. Now silence had company. Elias stepped onto the porch carrying his boots in one hand, and stopped when he saw Nayeli standing barefoot near the pasture fence beneath the pale dawn light. She faced the eastern horizon where the first thin line of sun was beginning to rise across the desert. Her eyes were closed. Her hands rested calmly at her sides while the morning wind moved gently through her dark braid. "What are you doing?" Elias asked quietly. Nayeli opened her eyes slowly but did not turn around. "Listening." Elias pulled on one boot. "To what?" A faint smile touched her face. "Everything white towns are too loud to hear." Elias glanced across the empty pasture. Wind creaked softly through dry grass, while cattle shifted near the water trough. Somewhere beyond the hills, a hawk cried once into the cold morning air. Nothing unusual, yet standing there beside her, he noticed something strange. The ranch did sound different lately, less hollow somehow. Nayeli looked toward him then, sunlight beginning to warm the edges of her face. "Your ranch breathes easier now." Elias snorted softly. "You talk about land like it is alive." "It is alive." She brushed one hand against the old fence rail beside her. "Places remember loneliness too." The words followed Elias long after breakfast. All morning, he found himself distracted while repairing a broken wheel near the barn. Every few minutes, he caught his eyes drifting toward the cabin porch, where Nayeli sat, sewing Clara's blue scarf carefully back together with thin thread she carried in her saddlebag. She worked with patient hands, gentle hands, the kind meant for healing old things instead of throwing them away. Around noon, Elias walked toward the well carrying a rusted bucket when he noticed something near the cottonwood tree beside the porch. 2 small wooden crosses, fresh flowers resting beneath them. His footsteps stopped immediately. For a moment, the entire ranch seemed to fall silent around him. Elias stared at the tiny graves behind the tree where Matthew and Clara had rested for 6 long years beneath Arizona dirt and endless sky. Nobody besides him had touched those graves since the funeral. Nobody. He looked toward Nayeli slowly. She lowered her sewing into her lap the moment she saw his expression. "I did not move anything," she said quietly. Elias swallowed hard. The flowers trembled slightly in the wind beside the crosses. "Wild desert flowers. Carefully gathered." "You found them." Nayeli nodded once. "Children should not sleep without color near them." Something inside Elias cracked painfully then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for old sorrow to breathe again after years buried beneath silence. He looked down toward the small graves while sunlight flickered softly through cottonwood leaves overhead. "I stopped coming here after a while," he admitted quietly. "At first I visited every morning, then once a week. Then," his voice roughened, "one day I realized I had not come at all." Nayeli rose slowly and walked toward him without fear. "A broken man builds walls," she said softly. "Sometimes even around love." Elias looked away sharply. Shame moved across his weathered face like shadow passing over stone. "You do not understand," he whispered. Nayeli stopped directly beside him beneath the tree. "No," she said gently. "I understand too well." Elias finally turned toward her then, truly looked at her, at the sadness hidden quietly behind her calm dark eyes. And for the first time since she arrived, he realized something he had been too lost inside himself to notice before. Nayeli carried loneliness too. 3 days later, Briar Creek stopped pretending to whisper. Elias felt it the moment he rode into town beneath the sharp afternoon sun. Conversation slowed when he passed. Men standing outside the barber shop watched him too carefully. Women near the church steps lowered their voices without lowering their eyes. Even the horses tied outside the saloon seemed tense beneath the dry desert heat. The rumors had grown larger than gossip now. They had become judgment. Elias stepped into the general store for flour and coffee, but before he reached the counter, Sheriff Coleman appeared near the doorway with his hat tucked beneath one arm. The older lawman looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Need a word, Mercer?" Elias set the coffee sack down slowly. "That usually means trouble." Coleman sighed quietly and glanced toward the townsfolk pretending not to listen. Pastor Whitmore gathered half the church council this morning. Elias already knew where this was heading. The sheriff rubbed one weathered hand across his jaw before speaking lower. They want the Apache woman gone. Silence settled hard between them. Somewhere outside, a wagon rattled across the dusty street, while wind carried the smell of horses through town. Elias looked toward the church standing at the far end of Briar Creek with its white wooden cross cutting sharply against the blue sky. "And if she stays?" he asked calmly. Sheriff Coleman hesitated too long before answering. "Town council says they might reconsider your cattle contracts for winter supply routes." Elias gave a faint, humorless smile. "There it is." Coleman lowered his voice further. "I am telling you this because I know what those contracts mean to your ranch." The sheriff studied him carefully. "You barely survived last winter, Elias." That part was true. 2 more bad seasons and Mercer Ranch would disappear into the same dust that swallowed forgotten places all across Arizona territory. Elias looked down at the coffee sack in his hands. Strange thing was, 6 weeks ago he probably would have sacrificed anything just to keep the ranch alive. Now the thought of returning to that silent, empty house felt worse than losing land ever could. Sheriff Coleman watched the realization cross his face slowly. "You care about her?" Elias answered without hesitation. "Yes." The sheriff nodded once like a man who already knew. "Then you better decide how much." When Elias returned home near sunset, he found Nayeli sitting beneath the cottonwood tree beside the 2 small graves. The blue scarf rested folded neatly in her lap, while golden evening light spilled across the ranch in soft, quiet waves. She looked up immediately when he approached, and somehow she seemed to understand before he even spoke. "The town has decided I am dangerous," she said softly. Elias removed his hat slowly. "The town decides many foolish things." Nayeli smiled sadly at that. "You did not answer my words." Elias stopped beside the graves. The wind moved gently through the tree branches overhead, while distant thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the mesas. "They want you gone," he admitted quietly. Nayeli lowered her gaze toward the scarf in her hands. She looked calm, too calm, like someone who had already expected pain long before it arrived. "Then I should leave before sunrise," she said softly. The words struck Elias harder than he expected. "No." Nayeli finally looked up at him again. "If I stay, your ranch suffers. If you leave," Elias said slowly, "this place becomes empty again." The honesty in his voice made her breath catch slightly. Elias stepped closer beneath the cottonwood shadows, close enough now to see sadness hiding behind her steady dark eyes. "6 years," he whispered. 6 years I woke up every morning believing loneliness was the safest thing a man could choose. The evening wind stirred around them gently. Then you arrived here asking strange questions and talking to chickens like they were people. That finally made Nayeli laugh softly through her sadness. Elias shook his head once, almost smiling himself. "And somewhere along the way," he admitted quietly, "this ranch stopped feeling haunted." Silence wrapped around them beneath the fading Arizona sunlight. Then Nayeli asked the question neither of them had dared speak aloud before now. "What happens if you choose me over the town?" Elias looked toward the distant lights of Briar Creek glowing faintly across the valley. Then he looked back at the lonely Apache woman standing beside his children's graves with Clara's blue scarf folded gently in her hands. "I guess," he said softly, "we finally find out whether lonely people are brave enough to stop being lonely." Winter arrived gently that year. Not with the cruel bitterness Elias Mercer remembered from seasons past, but with soft morning frost across the pasture and cold winds that carried the smell of cedar through the valley before sunrise. Snow touched the distant mountains beyond Briar Creek, while Mercer Ranch stood warm beneath thin trails of chimney smoke rising peacefully into the pale Arizona sky. The townspeople still talked, of course. Small towns always did. But something strange had happened over the months. The ranch that once looked abandoned now breathed with quiet life again. Fence posts stood repaired. Horses looked healthier. Lantern light glowed from the cabin windows late into the evening, while laughter sometimes drifted softly through the yard beneath the stars. People noticed those things even when pride kept them from speaking kindly about them. Sheriff Coleman noticed most of all. He sat outside the general store one cold December morning sipping coffee when Deputy Harris nodded toward the northern hills. "Mercer's riding into town," the young deputy said quietly. Coleman looked up beneath the brim of his hat, and saw Elias guiding his horse slowly down Main Street with the calm confidence of a man no longer hiding from the world. But it was not Elias who drew every eye in Briar Creek. It was the small child sitting in front of him beneath a thick wool blanket. The little boy could not have been older than 2. Dark hair, curious eyes, tiny gloved hands gripping the saddle horn while he looked around town with complete fascination. People stepped out onto porches silently as Elias dismounted near the general store. The child immediately pointed toward the barbershop window where paper snowflakes hung crookedly behind the glass. "Pretty," he whispered softly. Elias smiled before lifting the boy carefully down from the saddle. Sheriff Coleman watched closely while the old rancher adjusted the child's scarf with rough, gentle hands that once believed they would never hold family again. "Morning," Coleman said quietly as Elias approached. "Morning." The sheriff glanced toward the child standing beside him. "Your boy." Elias looked down at the little one with something soft and steady in his weathered eyes. "Ours." The answer spread through Briar Creek faster than any gossip before it. Some folks looked surprised, others uncomfortable, a few simply thoughtful, because standing there beneath the cold winter sunlight was something the town had not expected to see. Peace. Real peace. The child tugged lightly on Elias's coat, then pointed across the street excitedly. Nayeli stood outside the bakery holding a small paper sack, while snowflakes drifted softly through her dark braid. She smiled the moment she saw them, and the little boy immediately ran toward her through the dusting of snow. People watched carefully as Nayeli knelt down and wrapped him warmly in her arms before kissing the top of his head. Nothing improper, nothing dramatic, just love existing openly where loneliness used to live. Elias crossed the street slowly toward them while townsfolk stood frozen in silence all around Briar Creek. Nayeli looked up at him beneath the falling snow with the same calm dark eyes that once asked dangerous questions beside a campfire months ago. "I understand now," she said softly while the little boy rested happily against her shoulder. Elias smiled faintly. "About white people?" Nayeli shook her head gently. "About families." Snow drifted quietly across the town while horses stamped softly against frozen ground nearby. "Children are not made because people fear loneliness," she whispered. "They are made because sometimes two lonely people finally stop running from love." Elias stood there, looking at her for a long moment while cold winter wind moved gently through Briar Creek. Then, slowly, the old rancher reached for her hand in front of the entire town without shame or hesitation. Somewhere behind them, Sheriff Coleman smiled quietly into his coffee while Pastor Whitmore lowered his eyes toward the snowy street. And high above Mercer Ranch, beyond the endless desert and the sleeping mountains, the winter sky finally looked less empty too.